Right, hello again, everybody. My name's Peter Kinrade, and welcome to the latest session of the Marsden Jacob Talks Live. And today's topic is tackling single-use plastics, policy progress, and the path forward. And I hope you find the sessions interesting and useful today. Now, before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge country. Marsden Jacob Associates acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. We also pay our respects to their ancestors and elders past and present and emerging. And I'm speaking today from the east of Melbourne in Wurundjeri country. My name's Peter Kinrade. I'm an Associate Director at Marsden Jacob Associates for quite a long time now. I've been doing economics and policy work on circular economy, climate change, and other environmental issues. My circular economy work includes analysis and design of numerous container deposit schemes in various jurisdictions in Australia, and also policies relating to single-use plastics phase out in various states, and also some Pacific Island countries. And I'll hand over to Alex now, and Alex will introduce herself and start the presentation.
Thanks so much, Peter. So as Peter mentioned, I'm Alex Hegarty. I'm a consultant here at Marsden Jacob Associates. And I've got a lot of experience in public policy and integrated environmental management, which includes community consultation, non-market valuation of environmental resources, and biodiversity and conservation research and analysis, both here and also through the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development and the Australian Government's National Environmental Science Program. So why this topic and why now? I'm sure most of us are already aware that plastics in general is going to be a big issue in the coming decades. The impacts of single-use plastics, or SUPs, which we're speaking about here, including microplastics, are one of the greatest environmental challenges facing the global community, arguably just behind climate change and biodiversity loss. So the challenges of SUP management are being recognised both internationally and within Australia. At the moment, there are negotiations in progress through the UN to develop a legally binding international agreement, or what some of us are more familiar known as a treaty on plastic pollution. So this is currently going on. It's expected to be finished by the end of the year, but obviously with these sorts of things, they take a long time, and we can't really tell what the outcomes of that will be yet. It's still quite up in the air, but it's definitely on Australia's watch list now. SUPs were on problematic and unnecessary SUPs were on the Australian government's product stewardship priority list, and are now a key driver of proposed packaging regulation reforms, which are coming through the Commonwealth government at the moment. So why are single-use plastics, or SUPs, such a problem? Globally, we consume 400 million tonnes of plastic a year, and more than a third of that is single-use material designed for immediate disposal. So this is what we are referring to when we're talking about single-use plastics. In Australia, we consume 1.1 million tonnes of single-use plastics every year, and 6% of these are deemed problematic and unnecessary. So either not, there's already substitutes that could be used, or they are difficult to recycle, or break down with dangerous chemicals. That's what's meant by problematic and unnecessary. And probably the largest area where we are noticing impacts is in the marine environment. So up to 10% of SUPs leak into the environment, often ending up in our waterways and oceans. A lot of research has been done around the globe on marine litter, and even nationally with organisations like Tangaroa Blue, we're finding most marine litter is dominantly plastic, and a lot of that is single-use plastics. We're also becoming increasingly aware of the impact of microplastics in the environment. So plastics are now turning up in all environments, inside our food, inside our bodies. So that's an increasingly big issue. And then some SUPs contain hazardous chemicals as they break down. So actually leaching chemicals from the plastics into the environment, as well as some SUPs are just very difficult to recycle. So even if they might theoretically be recyclable, they're just not recyclable in practice. It's either too costly or too difficult on a large scale. Back over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Alex. So what is currently happening in Australia today around single-use plastics? And be true to say that there's currently a whole range of policies and actions aimed at tackling single-use plastics nationally. Firstly, we've got the National Packaging Targets 2025, which were initiated in 2018. And in terms of single-use plastics, that includes a target of 100% of plastics being recyclable, reusable, or compostable by 2025. That 70% of plastic packaging be recycled or composted, that there's a 20% average recycled content in plastics packaging, and that there's a phase out of certain problematic and unnecessary single-use plastics. And there's a list of about 14 plastics either for immediate or longer term phase out being considered. And to help deliver these targets, there's a range of initiatives that are also being undertaken. There's the 2020 Our Packaging Future that was developed by APCO. And I think there's a number of APCO representatives here today, so thanks for coming along. There's the 2021 National Plastics Plan, which is being initiated, or was being initiated through the Australian government. And there's the 2023 Action Plan for Problematic and Unnecessary Single-Use Plastic Packaging, also being initiated by APCO. So a lot is happening around single-use plastics policy in Australia, and it's fair to say that there's been a fair bit of progress in dealing with single-use plastics. That said, however, we still have a long way to go. And if, for example, we look at the targets, it'd be fair to say that most of the targets, we're having difficulty achieving those at the moment. If we talk about single-use plastics, target of 100% being recyclable, reusable, or compostable by 2025, we don't actually have actual numbers on that, but data that we do have suggests we're still a fair way short of that 100% target. And similarly with the recycling and composting rate for single-use plastics, the target of 70% by 2025, the data we have suggests that at the moment we're only around about 20% either being recycled or composted. And similarly again, with the average recycled content target of 20% by 2025, the actual figure we think at the moment is probably about 8%. And finally, with a phase-out rate of designated problematic plastics, we think there's only about a third of those plastics that are actively being considered in terms of the bans or phase out at the present. And when we look at those bans, there's some other issues too. One key issue is the limited consistency with bans that are being implemented in different jurisdictions. We know that there are some single-use plastic items that there's uniform consistency in terms of dealing with bans and phase-out, and that includes things like lightweight plastic bags, EPS foodware, and EPS loose-fill packaging. But in other areas, such as, for example, produce bags and coffee cups, there's very little consistency across jurisdictions. And similarly, if you look at many of the 14 priority items for future phase-out in the action plan, it'd be fair to say that a lot of these aren't on the radar of state governments at present. And that includes things like molded EPS packaging, coloured PET, rigid PVC, and polystyrene packaging, laminated soft packaging. So although there's been quite a lot of development in terms of bans across different jurisdictions, there's a problem in terms of lack of consistency between state and territory governments. So this should suggest that there is room for improvement. But if we are to implement new policy measures through the national packaging reforms, for example, there needs to be some clear objectives and principles that we should be looking at following. So whatever new initiatives are introduced over the next few years, we would certainly argue that we need to be very clear on the objectives and principles that need to be underpinning those new policies and plans. Without going into specifics of what those principles and policies objectives should be, some suggestions include, for example, the precautionary principle. And that precautionary principle is a long-established sustainable development principles, and it essentially suggests, in the context of single-use plastics, that we should prevent irreversible environmental harm from single-use plastics. And that's certainly consistent with the notion that certain single-use plastics, not all of them, but some single-use plastics probably need to be phased out or banned. Similarly, I think there's wide recognition now about circular economy principles and the need to move our economies towards that circular economy basis. And in the case of single-use plastics, it really means maximizing circular value through designing for reuse, recycling, and production and supply efficiency. So the whole of the supply chain needs to be looking at maximizing value and maximizing the reuse and recycling. And other policy objectives that we think need to be very strongly considered in terms of consistency with economic principles. Firstly, national consistency or harmonisation. I've already mentioned that in the context of bans of single-use plastics, but across the board, there's a number of areas where national consistency and in some cases actual harmonisation of policies need to be pursued to get the most effective and efficient outcomes in terms of managing single-use plastics. And similarly, when we're talking about meeting the other objectives, wherever possible, we need to be looking at maximising cost-effectiveness approaches, or approaches that maximise cost-effectiveness to achieving those objectives. Where might we want to be heading in terms of future policy initiatives? If we look at what's being canvassed under the reforming packaging regulation process, and it'd be fair to say that the fact that that process is in train is a recognition, at least at the federal level, that more needs to be done on single-use plastics in Australia. And many of you probably have seen the consultation draft paper that's been out the last few months, and that a number of options are being considered or canvassed through that consultation paper, and that includes further bans on problematic plastics. It includes other mandatory requirements such as packaging design and/or a product stewardship scheme. Now, based on our experience looking at both at single-use plastics, on container deposit schemes, and a range of other recycling and waste management issues, we would argue that there's probably a pretty strong case for looking at a product stewardship scheme as the underlying basis and foundation for pursuing single-use plastic management effectively in the future. But it's important to understand that a product stewardship scheme is not likely to be the be-all and end-all, and will likely need to be accompanied by other policy initiatives. But it's also important that any product stewardship scheme that is introduced is well designed. And when we talk about a well-designed product stewardship scheme, we think there's, based on our experiences, a number of features that need to be built into that product stewardship scheme. For starters, it needs to have full coverage of all target materials supplied to the market in Australia. And if that's the case, it's most likely to require either a co-regulatory or regulatory scheme. It's a co-regulatory or regulatory scheme that is the best means to achieve and ensure that the target material is fully covered. Also, a well-designed product stewardship scheme should also include things like setting targets and benchmarks. Importantly, it needs to levy material at a sufficient rate to cover all scheme costs, and that includes all the collection costs, sorting costs, and reprocessing costs. And certainly our experience with product stewardship schemes in the past is that one of the difficulties some of them have faced up until now is that there is not sufficient revenue to cover the costs of the scheme, which means either that shortcuts are potentially being taken or that we're not achieving the maximum benefits in terms of recycling outcomes. Similarly, a good, well-designed product stewardship scheme needs to ensure good consumer access to collection and drop-off points. It needs to be well supported by design requirements, as well as market development and consumer education. And finally, good governance arrangements, including board representative, ensuring that it is representative of the entire supply chain of plastics and other packaging. Things like an independent chair and an independent audit functions too. So governance arrangements for the product stewardship scheme are extremely important as well. So when we look at a product stewardship scheme, as I said, it's not the be and all and end all, and a number of factors need to be considered alongside a product stewardship scheme. I've already mentioned a few key features of product stewardship scheme, and either alongside or as part of that product stewardship scheme, we need to look at incentives built into the scheme to promote higher order value reuse and higher order recycling. And that's especially important for harder to recycle materials. So it's important that the incentives are built into the scheme or sit alongside the scheme that do promote these sort of outcomes. As well as that, sitting alongside the scheme, it's probably important that we have nationally consistent minimum recycled content. That's already been part of the existing plastics plan, but that packaging plan, but that needs to be pursued as part of the overall policy framework, sitting alongside the product stewardship scheme. A key difficulty we've faced up until now with both with plastics recycling and with other recycling programs, but particularly in the case of plastics recycling, and we've seen it with things like the 2022 collapse of the Red Cycle scheme, is a lack of markets for recycled plastic. And so a number of policy initiatives are needed to sit along the scheme that promote markets for recycled plastics, and particularly policy initiatives including nationally consistent minimum recycled content and government procurement policies to drive the markets for recycled plastics. And finally, I might mention also the need for some harmonisation of collection systems for packaging, and that includes plastics packaging, as well as supported by further investment in drop-off sorting and recycled infrastructure. And in terms of those harmonised collection systems, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the problem in terms of a lack of understanding amongst householders. I know it's the case in my own household that people are very unclear about what can and can't be recycled in terms of plastics at the moment. And part of that problem is that if you go from one local government area to another local government area, there is often quite a lot of differences in terms of what can and can't be collected, sorted and recycled. And our experience where we've been looking at harmonisation of waste management systems across Australia is that there is a lot of favour amongst state governments and across jurisdictions and across local councils to move towards harmonisation in terms of waste management systems in Australia. So I might hand it over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Peter. So what else needs to happen to make this work? Alongside a well-designed product stewardship scheme, as Peter mentioned, we will need to see harmonisation. So this slide's just setting up what I'm going to talk about for the next few slides. But with all of the following slides, harmonisation needs to be thought about with each, not just with the national standards, but to keep up with the incoming international standards as well. So harmonisation of policy across different jurisdictions, packaging design standards, programs for promoting reusable alternatives, and standards for SUP substitutes. So these are all things that will need to happen alongside a well-designed product stewardship scheme. So as we've already touched on, harmonising bans on problematic plastics will be a really important step in this process. So the policy landscape in Australia at the moment is very mixed. As Peter mentioned, it can be different between states and even local governments. And many of them are voluntary initiatives, such as the 2018 supermarket ban on lightweight plastics. And there's a lot of disparity between these state policies and inconsistent definitions. And what this does is just create a lot of uncertainty around what can and can't be recycled. To combat this, we would need a national register to establish a unified register to list all plastics banned across all states. This will reduce confusion and regulatory discrepancies. And we also need agreed phase-out dates, so standardized timelines for phasing out certain types of plastics to give both businesses and consumers clarity and time for adjustments. So this will increase the economic efficiency in that the standardized policies will reduce costs for suppliers in managing these multiple new regulations. And the unified policies across states will help consumers understand what plastics are banned and restricted. And this is really important just for both the supplier and the consumer, as I said, just to understand what is coming. So alongside that, we would want a nationally standardized packaging design. So this would be setting national standards on accepted polymer types. So limiting harmful plastics and aligning with sustainability goals. So this would actually be setting standards on what types of plastics should be used, what chemicals in plastics are restricted, whether plastics should be containing color or not. All these things need to be considered to help support recyclability and reuse. So that's our second point. Encourage designs that support recyclability and reuse. Supporting recyclability by making a more standard type of plastic that is easier to recycle. But there's also ways that we can standardize packaging that can support reuse as well. So on the right here in the blue box, I've just got a little case study where in Latin America, since 2018, Coca-Cola has used a standardized plastic bottle design across all their different beverages. And what this means is that the bottles, no matter what they were filled with, can be sent back to any factory. The paper labels get washed off and they just get rebranded with the new beverage. This also helps with the logistics of drop-off and collection and sorting that Peter mentioned earlier. If the bottles are just able to be rebranded and reused, it reduces that burden of having to make sure they go back to the right suppliers. So the benefits of this is that it supports circular economy by directly reducing waste, whether it's through increasing its recyclability or reuse potential. And it also promotes innovation through sustainable packaging design. We also would want to see programs that promote reusable alternatives. So we need to implement a coordinated national strategy to promote reusable items and include incentives for consumers and businesses. So it's interesting, in a lot of our work that we do here at Marsden Jacob Associates, we found that moving to a reuse system can often be the most cost-effective solution above finding substitutes or alternative plastics. But it's just very difficult to get these sorts of programs to work on large scales. There are already some programs in use, such as the Victorian government has a funding program to support private businesses to become more reusable. And they do that by highlighting different businesses through a web page as well. And that just allows consumers to make more informed decisions when they are going out to eat or out to drink. They can go somewhere that is already using reuse programs. There's also national programs like the Boomerang Alliance, again, which supporting reuse with information. So basically giving resources to both private businesses and consumers to allow them to more easily shift or to see the benefits of using a reusable alternative rather than a single-use plastic. And overseas, there are slightly larger scale versions of this happening. There's in Denmark, there's circular economy centers. This is where the recycling centers have basically opened up over the weekends to become more of a reuse center, and people can come and collect all sorts of goods. This has actually reduced the amount of recyclable waste by more than 2 metric tons each day that they open the center. So people are able to take all sorts of things from the recycling center, and it is just encouraging a direct reuse system on a slightly larger scale. So the benefits of this is that it obviously reduces the reliance on single-use items by replacing them with a reusable alternative. And as I mentioned earlier, it's often the most cost-effective. There's obviously not a reusable alternative for all instances of single-use plastics. For example, medical plastics might be harder to find a reusable alternative, but there's certainly plenty of opportunities in the food and beverage space where this could be implemented. And finally, having some national standards for SUP substitutes. So bans on SUPs need to be supported with standards for alternatives and substitutes. We don't want to swap one problem out for another problem. So we need to ensure that any substitutes we adopt don't create unintended consequences. For example, the coated paper cups has been a big move from single-use plastics to more of these coated paper style, technically recyclable materials, but in practice, they have been pretty difficult to recycle. So before we move to substitutes, we need to ensure that there's actually the supporting infrastructure to either recycle or compost them. And so the same case for the bio and compostable plastics. These have been quite quickly taken up, but there's still some questions around how compostable they actually are, and that they actually need quite a specific composting environment to degrade properly. So the benefits of having these standards around substitutes is it ensures the substitutes are genuinely sustainable, safe, and compatible with our current recycling management systems. We don't want to replace one problem with a new, different problem.
Thanks for that, Alex. So just to recap, we believe that government should agree on and proceed with the national packaging reforms that are being canvassed, with particular emphasis on single-use plastics packaging reforms. But I guess it would be true to say that consistent with general economic principles, the packaging reform should be done across the whole packaging supply chain and not just focus on single-use plastics to avoid any unnecessary distortions being introduced into the markets. As we've said previously, we think the reform should be underpinned by some clear objectives and principles. Now, the details of those need to be worked through, but it's important that everyone knows where we need to be heading before we can start heading in that direction. We also believe that a well-designed product stewardship scheme is likely be an important aspect of the reforms. As I said, it's not the be-all and end-all, but we think a product stewardship scheme is likely to be the starting basis for those reforms. But the product stewardship scheme needs to be supported by other reforms, including possibly harmonised single-use plastic bans, packaging design standards, including for single-use plastic substitutes, schemes to promote reusable alternatives. Alex has gone through some case studies here, and we think they are a cost-effective alternative and need to be really effectively promoted. And policies to drive markets for recycled plastics is a key objective or key outcome that we need to be looking at if the product stewardship scheme is ultimately going to be effective. And as we've already discussed, we believe all the reforms should be consistent across Australia as far as possible, as well as with the internationally legally binding instrument or treaty on plastic pollution. So we need to be keeping an eye on what's happening internationally and ensure whatever reforms are implemented here are consistent with what is happening internationally.
I'd like to thank everyone for attending and being very engaged today. Thank you so much for all your questions.
And I'd like to thank everybody else as well too, and thank Amanda for helping us out with this presentation today.
Thank
But
you.
also I just mentioned too that those who've attended today, thanks again greatly for coming along and listening to us. If you have any further questions or feel as though we haven't adequately answered your questions to date, feel free to send some more questions through over the next few days and we'll endeavour to answer those, get back to you. So thanks everybody for coming on and listening to us today.
Thanks so much.